Welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I want to talk about 7 Formula One drivers who I feel are under some pressure going into silly season for this 2024 F1 season. I did this video last year as well, and of the drivers I talked about, only one of them lost their seat, and that of course was Nick De Vries, who ended up losing his seat about a month after I did that video. So we'll see if any of these drivers I'm going to talk about today, if any of them lose their seat, or kind of we find out they lose their seat through silly season over the next couple months or so. And I'm going to do these 7 drivers in order of most pressure to, I think, least pressure, but still under some degree of pressure. Now, starting with number 1, I think is the rather obvious one, and that is Logan Sargent at Williams. Now, for Logan Sargent, I think his second year in Formula One has been a slight improvement on his rookie season last year. But that being said, the improvements that we've seen in both race pace and in qualifying form have not really been enough, I feel, that would warrant a third year in Formula One. Just what we've seen from him over the last year and a half have kind of shown that he doesn't really, I think, at his ceiling, doesn't really project to be, a particularly strong Formula One driver. And I think that's why Williams, the team, are starting to look at other options. And there's rumors that they're looking at drivers like Bottas, Gasly, Ocon, Sainz even, as replacements for that seat. As in terms of Williams junior drivers, they don't really have anyone who would really be able to step up into the seat, especially they've kind of been burned by, I think, bringing Sargent into F1 a little bit too early. Nonetheless, for Sargent, kind of reminds me a lot of Latifi in some ways, in that that really top end pace, the flashes of potential we haven't really ever seen in his time in F1 so far. So I think of the 7 drivers, I think he's the one who's almost certainly not going to be in F1 next year. Now, number 2, I'm going to go with Zhou Guanyu of Sauber. Stick these in, there we go. Now, for Zhou, qualifying has been a real struggle this year, and it's actually really interesting. If you look at the qualifying data between himself and Valtteri Bottas over their almost 2.5 seasons together, the gap between Bottas and Zhou in qualifying has actually gotten bigger and bigger over those 2.5 years. So for Zhou, I think the reality is in qualifying, he hasn't out-qualified Bottas this year. The qualifying, I think, is really holding him back. His race pace has improved quite a bit last year and a bit, I would say, to the point where there's, I don't think, a whole lot separating them in the races. But that being said, the qualifying is definitely holding him back. And with Sauber being such an inconsistent team in the races with their pit stops, struggles earlier in the year, the fact they're not really particularly strong on any type of circuit, I think really makes it hard for either Zhou or Bottas to really kind of stand out. But that being said, I'm putting Zhou here simply because the qualifying margin is quite big. It's over 0.3 of a second, and he hasn't out-qualified Bottas yet this year. With Audi coming in 2025 or in 2026, but it seems like they have quite a bit of say with the driver selections for 2025. Given by them signing Nico Hülkenberg and admitting that his marketing potential as a German driver might have factored in, might have helped. I don't really see how Zhou sticks around with Sauber for next year, simply because I think the team will want to have a fresh slate, and he hasn't really shown enough to kind of warrant being there alongside Hülkenberg. So it'll be interesting to see what he does. I'll talk about that a bit later when I do my predictions for silly season for next season in the next couple days. Now, moving on to number 3. I'm going to go with Kevin Magnussen. Now, for Magnussen, bit of a tough season. I think there's been a lot of things that's going on with Magnussen. So first, for Magnussen, qualifying form has definitely been a struggle. I believe he's been out-qualified every race bar one to Nico Hülkenberg, and that's just taking the main qualifying sessions into consideration, not the sprint qualifyings. So qualifying hasn't been great. So I think that's definitely a big mark against him. The other thing has been the fact that he's picked up so many penalty points in the first third of the season. He's already on 10 penalty points this year. pretty high risk of a race ban, was kind of lucky not to get more penalty points at Monaco with his crash with Perez on the opening lap. So in that respect, I think there's two things that kind of are holding it, that are kind of being held against him. The fact that, one, his qualifying is not great. Number two, his racecraft has been pretty poor. That being said, he's been doing those crazy things in order to help his teammate Nico Hülkenberg get points. So I think on that respect, I think teams will know that, the teams will know, and Haas will know that he's willing to basically do anything for the team, even if it does hurt himself. The other thing as well, we know Haas is losing one of their drivers. We know Hülkenberg is going to Sauber next year. And F1 teams generally don't like to change both of their drivers at once. So I think that actually really increases the chances that Magnussen sticks around next year. But it's something that we'll see. But that's really the reason why I have him below both Zhou and Sargent on this index, because I think those two things are kind of points in his favor. Now, number 4. Daniel Ricciardo. Now for Ricciardo, this is a bit of an odd one. Oh dear, we don't have space for the magnet, but we're going to just stick it over here. For Daniel Ricciardo, I think this season has definitely not gone the way he would have wanted. I think, the storyline coming into the 2024 season was that he was going to come in, he was going to dominate Tsunoda at RB. He was going to position himself to be that driver who would replace Sergio Perez at Red Bull. And that those things have not really happened. She struggled massively, particularly in qualifying compared to Tsunoda. Qualifying head-to-head, I believe, is 7-1 in the main qualifying sessions, and I think the gap's about 0.2 of a second, which is just not good enough. For Ricciardo, the race pace I think has been okay. It hasn't been awful, but that qualifying is really hurting him, and it makes it impossible to make up those differences in starting positions compared to Tsunoda. And on top of that, he hasn't picked up a single point in a non-sprint event to start this season. However, the things I think that are helping Ricciardo are the fact that one, I hate to say this, but it seems like when the Faenza team basically secured that sponsorship agreement with Visa and Cash App, it was rumored basically from even at points last year that a big part of the reason, the big part of the deal was that Ricciardo would be part of the team, and which effectively makes him a pay driver at this point, which is quite unfortunate to say because we know how good of a driver he was kind of during his peak. But that being said, for Ricciardo, I'm sure, because so much of the storylines were about him going to Red Bull, I'm sure there were extra clauses where it's like if he was promoted to Red Bull, that'd be okay, but it may also be that they can't really drop him without suffering some kind of financial penalty as well from those sponsorship deals. And that's something that we don't really know. But I think given his performance, honestly, not too dissimilar from Nick DeVries last year, but I do think that, his marketability as a driver is unfortunately one of those things that's really helping him potentially hold on to his seat for 2025. Now, number 5, I'm going to put Sergio Perez. Now, for Perez, unlike this time last year, he actually has a contract he doesn't have a contract for next year. So his position's, I think, a lot more at risk than it was at this point last year. First 5 or 6 races to start the season were pretty good. He was second in the Drivers' Championship, but these last 2 races, Imola and Monaco, the start of the European season, have basically been a repeat of what we saw in 2023. And unfortunately for Perez, if that continues, Red Bull's Constructors' Championship may be at risk. However, that being said, there are rumors flying around that, he's been offered a 1-year contract, potentially a 2-year contract, and that, he'll be announced as the driver for Red Bull very shortly, which, may make this video kind of pointless. But that being said, for Perez, it's so hit and miss with him, so inconsistent. He'll have races where he looks great, and he'll be, right behind Verstappen, not necessarily challenging Verstappen, but being right behind him, doing exactly what he needs to be doing, like I said, during the early part of the season. But unfortunately, his last 2 weekends have not been particularly good. And in F1, you're only as good as your last race. So, we'll see how this storyline develops. But for now, I think Perez is definitely a bit lower on the scale compared to the drivers I have ahead. Now, I got 2 more to go. So these are drivers who I think will probably be on the grid next year, but you never know. And the driver number 6 is Esteban Ocon. So for Ocon, what I just said about drivers only being as good as their last race really applies to this guy. He elicited quite the reaction from his team principal, F1 commentators, for his botched overtake on Pierre Gasly at the Monaco Grand Prix. And I think reality is doesn't have a contract for next year. I don't know what Alpine are going to do. They have Gasly, they have Ocon, they also have Jack Doohan, who would be a potential option. I think an okay option, not like a superstar in waiting like Piastri was when he was on the sidelines. And they also have a pretty poor car, which makes it really hard for them to attract other drivers to their team. And for Ocon, I think unfortunately he's built this reputation of a guy who's really hard to work with, a guy who fights his teammates incredibly hard. We know he got involved in incidents with Perez, with Alonso, and now he's gotten into multiple incidents with Gasly. Not saying that those other incidents, particularly Australia last year, were Ocon's fault, but it's just the reality is that he's come to blows with wheel to wheel with all three of his last four teammates in F1. So for Ocon, if he were to be dropped, and I think right now his performances on track for the most part have been pretty good. Out-qualified Gasly most of the races. He's picked up a single point in Imola, or I believe, or it wasn't Imola. But for Ocon, on track has been pretty good, but it's kind of this extracurricular stuff that may make other teams wary. He was rumored to be connected to Audi, perhaps connected to Haas or Williams, but seeing this, other teams may look at that and say, there may be better options available. Now, for number 7, I'm gonna go with. Now for Stroll, it's a tricky one. We know his performance is not great. We know he's not that solid of a driver, but honestly, for the most part, his performance outside of that one moment in China this year has not been that bad. Qualifying is actually 4-piece between himself and Alonso, which is definitely a massive improvement compared to where things were last year. The race pace, points on track haven't really been there, but that being said, the cars really struggled massively. And for Stroll, I'm not really sure what's going to happen. Again, like I said in last year's video, if you treat Stroll like you would any other driver, I probably would have him quite a few places higher. But that being said, I think with Honda coming in, there are some drivers who I think would like that seat, such as Tsunoda. Sainz, I think, would also be very interested in it if it was available. And I think it seems at this point that it's basically Stroll can decide if he wants to leave F1 at some point, and when that time comes, I think there'll be a lot of drivers who want that seat. But like in terms of actual external pressure, it's kind of hard to say. I think at this point there's still some pressure on Stroll, but where the team is in the Constructors' Championship, unless RB makes a massive step up in the coming races, I think as long as they're solidly 5th in the Constructors, not really challenging 4th, not really challenged by the 6th team, and with how things are going, I don't think there's going to be a ton of pressure on Stroll in the coming months. So there you go. There's my 7 drivers who I feel are most under pressure on the F1 grid going into silly season for next year. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.